November 13th, 1944. A cold rain fell across the English countryside as a military transport truck rumbled through the gates of a temporary prisoner of war facility outside Cheltenham. Inside the covered bed of the vehicle, 23 German women sat in tense silence, their gray auxiliary uniforms still bearing the dust and grime of their capture 3 weeks earlier in France. They had been told nothing about their destination, only that they were being transferred to England for the duration of the war. Now, as the truck shuddered to a stop and British voices called out in a language most of them barely understood, fear settled over them like a heavy blanket. 26-year-old Marguerite Kessler pressed herself against the rough canvas wall of the truck, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She had served as a radio operator for the Wehrmacht, believing she was defending her homeland from Allied aggression. Everything she had been taught about the British painted them as cruel oppressors who showed no mercy to prisoners, especially women prisoners. She expected beatings, starvation, perhaps worse. The propaganda films she had watched in training showed British soldiers as monsters, savage and without honor. Now she was about to face them directly. The canvas flap at the back of the truck was pulled aside, revealing a stocky British sergeant with graying hair and tired eyes. He gestured for the women to climb down, his voice gruff but not unkind. Marguerite translated his words for the others, her English hesitant and accented. They were to follow him to the barracks, where they would be processed and assigned quarters. The women climbed down slowly, their legs stiff from the long journey, their faces masks of resignation and barely contained terror. The facility was smaller than the male prisoner camps they had heard about. A collection of wooden barracks surrounded by high fences, it looked hastily constructed and temporary. British soldiers watched them pass with curious expressions, but Marguerite noticed something that confused her. Their faces showed interest, even sympathy, but not the hatred she had expected to see. One young soldier, barely 20 years old, nodded respectfully as they walked by. The gesture was so unexpected that Marguerite nearly stumbled. They were led to a long wooden building and directed inside. The interior was plain but clean, with rows of narrow beds covered in blankets that appeared to be thick and warm. Marguerite had expected to sleep on bare floors in freezing conditions. Instead, she found herself standing in a space that, while certainly not comfortable, was far better than anything she had imagined. A female British officer stood at the front of the room, waiting for the women to settle. She spoke slowly, and Marguerite translated as best she could. They would be given clean uniforms, allowed to wash, and then taken to the mess hall for their evening meal. The word meal sparked whispered conversations among the German women. They had been given minimal rations during transport, and most had not eaten a proper meal in days. But what could they expect from British prison food? Certainly nothing more than thin soup and stale bread. They had no way of knowing that within 2 hours, their entire understanding of their captors would be fundamentally challenged by something as simple as what appeared on their plates. The processing took longer than expected. Each woman was photographed, her information recorded in careful English script by a bored-looking corporal who seemed more interested in finishing his shift than in treating them as dangerous enemies. Marguerite watched him work, noting how he yawned between questions, how he offered a distracted smile when she struggled to spell her hometown in English. This casual indifference felt almost insulting. Where was the hostility? Where was the fear that she, as an enemy of Britain, should inspire? 22-year-old Elsa Brandt stood beside Marguerite, her blonde hair still pinned in the severe style required by their auxiliary corps regulations. She had served as a clerk in a Wehrmacht administrative office in Paris, processing supply requests and troop movements. She had never fired a weapon or witnessed combat directly, but she had worn her uniform with pride, believing she was part of something righteous and necessary. Now that uniform marked her as a prisoner, and she felt the weight of that change pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. After processing, the women were shown to a washing facility, where they were given soap, actual soap, not the harsh lye mixture they had grown accustomed to during the final months of the war. The water was heated, not scalding but genuinely warm, and for the first time in weeks they were able to wash away the grime of travel and captivity. Marguerite stood under the stream of water, feeling it run through her dark hair, and found herself fighting back tears. She had expected cruelty and degradation. Instead, she was being allowed basic human dignity, and the contrast to her expectations left her feeling disoriented and confused. They were given clean clothing, not their own uniforms, but simple gray dresses that marked them as prisoners without being deliberately humiliating. The fabric was rough but clean, and each woman also received a sweater against the November cold. Elsa ran her fingers over the knit pattern, wondering why their captors would waste resources on keeping German prisoners warm. Shouldn't they be left to suffer? Wasn't that what happened to enemies during war? As they dressed, the women spoke in hushed German, sharing their confusion and unease. None of them could reconcile what they were experiencing with what they had been taught about the British. Greta Zimmermann, a former nurse who had treated wounded German soldiers in field hospitals, suggested that perhaps this kindness was temporary, designed to make them lower their guard before the real punishment began. Others nodded, agreeing that this must be some kind of psychological tactic. When they were finally dressed and assembled, a young British private appeared at the door. "Dinner time," he announced in heavily accented German that made several of the women smile despite themselves. He gestured for them to follow him, and they filed out into the cold evening air, heading toward a large building from which warm light and the smell of cooking food emerged. Their first meal as prisoners of the British was about to begin, and with it, the first crack in everything they believed they knew about their enemies. The mess hall was warm, heated by large stoves at either end of the long room. The German women filed in, maintaining their military bearing even in their prisoner dresses, their faces carefully composed to show neither fear nor gratitude. Long wooden tables stretched across the space, already set with plates, utensils, and cups. The sight of actual place settings, rather than the bare tables they had expected, added another layer of confusion to their already disoriented state. British soldiers occupied tables on one side of the hall, eating their own meals and occasionally glancing over at the new arrivals with mild curiosity. The women were directed to tables on the opposite side, the physical separation clear but not emphasized. Marguerite noticed how the British soldiers returned to their conversations after their brief looks, treating the presence of enemy prisoners as ordinary rather than threatening or exciting. She had expected to be objects of hatred or mockery. Instead, they seemed to be simply part of the daily routine. A middle-aged British woman in a stained apron emerged from the kitchen, followed by two younger women carrying large trays. They moved down the line of German prisoners, placing plates before each woman with efficient, practiced motions. Marguerite stared down at her plate, unable to process what she was seeing. A thick piece of pastry covered something that steamed gently, releasing a rich, meaty aroma. Beside it sat a generous portion of mashed potatoes and what appeared to be cooked carrots and peas. This was not prison food. This was not even ordinary food. This looked like something served at special occasions, at celebrations. Elsa leaned close to Marguerite, whispering urgently in German, "What is this? Is today some kind of British holiday?" Marguerite shook her head, equally confused. She looked around and saw that the British soldiers were eating identical meals, treating them with the casual indifference of people consuming everyday food rather than special treats. But how could this be everyday food? The portions alone seemed impossibly generous. The pastry looked freshly baked. The vegetables appeared to have been cooked with butter. Greta Zimmermann, sitting across from them, stared at her plate with wide eyes. "In Germany," she whispered, "we have not seen food like this in months. Our soldiers in the field were receiving reduced rations. Civilians were surviving on potato soup and black bread. And here we are, prisoners of war, being served what looks like a feast. What kind of game are they playing?" Several other women nodded, their expressions mirroring Greta's suspicion and disbelief. A British officer stood and addressed them in slow, clear English. Marguerite translated, though she stumbled over some of the words. "Welcome to the facility. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. This is your evening meal. Eat." The simplicity of the statement made it even more surreal. There was no explanation for the abundance, no acknowledgement that what sat before them was anything unusual. The officer sat back down and returned to his own meal, dismissing them from his attention. The German women looked at each other, uncertain how to proceed. Was this food safe? Was it a test of some kind? Marguerite lifted her fork with trembling fingers, aware that every woman at her table was watching to see what she would do. As the one among them with the best English skills, she had somehow become their unofficial leader, the one expected to navigate this strange new world first. She cut through the golden pastry crust, releasing a cloud of steam that carried with it the rich smell of cooked meat and gravy. Inside the pastry shell was dark meat in thick sauce, studded with what appeared to be chunks of kidney and surrounded by more gravy than she had seen in months. She raised a small bite to her lips, hesitated, then placed it in her mouth. The flavors exploded across her tongue with an intensity that almost made her gasp. The meat was tender, the gravy rich and savory, seasoned with herbs she could not identify, but that tasted like comfort itself. The pastry was buttery and flaky, dissolving against her palate. She had not tasted anything this substantial, this satisfying, since before the war had turned against Germany, since before the rations had grown tighter and the food had become increasingly scarce. Seeing Marguerite eat, the other women began to try their own meals. The mess hall filled with the soft sounds of forks against plates, of surprised murmurs quickly suppressed, of women discovering that the impossible food before them was not only real but genuinely delicious. Elsa closed her eyes after her first bite, her face reflecting an emotion somewhere between pleasure and pain. "This is better than what we served at officers' dinners in Paris," she whispered. "How can prisoners eat better than officers?" Across the table, Greta methodically worked through her meal, her nurse's practicality overcoming her suspicion. She sampled each element separately, the meat, the gravy, the pastry, the vegetables, as if conducting a medical examination. "Real beef," she reported quietly. "Fresh vegetables, not preserved. Butter in these potatoes. This meal contains more fat and protein than our soldiers were receiving in the final months." She paused, her fork hovering over her plate. "Either the British have resources beyond anything we were told, or they are deliberately trying to show us something." 20-year-old Anna Richter, the youngest of the prisoners, ate with undisguised hunger, her reserve crumbling before the reality of the first satisfying meal she had experienced in months. She had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps straight from school, young and idealistic, believing everything she had been taught about German superiority and Allied deprivation. Now she was eating food that contradicted every lesson she had learned. If the British could feed their prisoners this well, what did that say about the relative strength of the two nations? What did it say about the lies she had been told? The British soldiers paid little attention to the German women's reactions, focused on their own meals and conversations. Occasionally one would glance over, but without the hostility or mockery the women had expected. Some appeared sympathetic, others simply indifferent. Marguerite watched a young soldier smile at something his companion said, then automatically look over at the prisoners as if checking that they had everything they needed. After the meal, the women were escorted back to their barracks in the gathering darkness. The November evening had turned cold, and their breath formed clouds in the air as they walked in formation, their minds racing with questions they dared not voice aloud until they were alone. Once inside their quarters, with the door closed and only their own voices to hear, the dam of suppressed reaction finally broke. They gathered in small clusters between the beds, speaking in urgent whispers that gradually grew louder as their confusion demanded expression. "This cannot be normal food," insisted Greta, her practical nature seeking logical explanations. "Perhaps today was a special day, some British holiday we do not know about. Or perhaps they are fattening us up before sending us somewhere worse." Her suggestions made sense to many of the women, who nodded eagerly, grateful for any explanation that allowed them to maintain their understanding of how prisoner treatment should work. The alternative, that British abundance was simply this great, was too disturbing to accept without resistance. Marguerite sat on her narrow bed, her mind working through what she had observed. She had watched the British soldiers eating identical meals, had seen how they treated the food with casual familiarity rather than special appreciation. She had noticed the kitchen staff working with the efficient routine of people preparing everyday meals rather than elaborate feasts. Everything suggested that what they had eaten was, impossibly, simply normal British prison food. But accepting that meant accepting that everything they had been taught about British weakness and deprivation was false. Elsa paced between the beds, her agitation visible in every movement. "In Paris," she said, "we received reports about conditions in Britain, food shortages, rationing, civilian suffering. The propaganda showed British children starving while German efficiency kept our people fed. But if those reports were lies, if Britain has been this strong all along, then what else were we told that was not true?" Her question hung in the air, too dangerous to answer yet impossible to ignore. The women fell silent, each contemplating the implications. 24-year-old Helene Fischer, who had served as a telephone operator in Brussels, spoke up from her corner bed. Her voice was quiet but steady, carrying the weight of someone who had already been questioning her beliefs before capture. "I worked in communications," she said. "I saw messages about supply problems, about reduced rations for troops, about equipment shortages, and that was months ago, before things got worse. If we were struggling then, and the British were supposed to be worse off than us, how are they feeding prisoners like this now? Unless they were never worse off, unless we were the ones who were weak." The suggestion that Germany, not Britain, had been the weaker nation struck at the core of everything they had believed. Anna Richter, still young enough to cling to her idealism, shook her head firmly. "There must be another explanation," she insisted. "Perhaps this facility is special. Perhaps they are trying to turn us into informants by treating us well." The next morning arrived with weak November sunlight filtering through the barracks windows. The women woke to the sound of a bell ringing across the compound, signaling the start of the daily routine. They dressed quickly in their gray prisoner dresses, still uncertain what to expect from their first full day in British captivity. Marguerite noticed how some of the women maintained their military precision even in these circumstances, making their beds with hospital corners and standing at attention when the British officer entered to announce breakfast. Old habits died hard, even when the uniform was gone. Breakfast brought another shock. Porridge, thick and served with milk and a small spoonful of sugar. Toast with margarine and a thin spread of jam. Tea, real tea, hot and strong. It was simple food, certainly less elaborate than the previous evening's dinner, but it was filling and warm. Marguerite calculated mentally, trying to determine how many calories this breakfast contained, how it compared to what German soldiers had been receiving in the field. The comparison was not favorable to Germany, and that realization settled in her stomach like a stone. After breakfast, the women were assigned to various work details around the compound. It was explained through a combination of English and gestures that prisoners were expected to contribute to the maintenance of the facility. Marguerite found herself assigned to help in the administrative office, her language skills making her useful for translation work. Elsa and Anna were sent to the laundry. Greta, with her medical background, was taken to the small infirmary to assist the British medical officer with organizing supplies. It was during these work assignments that the small acts of kindness began. Private Thomas Cooper, a lanky young man from somewhere in northern England, was supervising the laundry detail. He noticed that Anna was shivering in her thin prisoner dress as she worked with the cold water used for washing. Without comment, he disappeared and returned minutes later with an extra sweater, which he offered to her with an awkward smile and a few words of German he had clearly memorized phonetically. "Warm, yes?" Anna took the sweater with trembling hands, her eyes wide with confusion at this unnecessary consideration from an enemy soldier. In the administrative office, Marguerite struggled with an English typewriter, its keyboard layout different from the German machines she was accustomed to. The British corporal supervising her work, a middle-aged man named Davies, watched her frustration for several minutes before pulling over a chair and sitting beside her. Slowly, patiently, he showed her the differences in the layout, his manner more that of a teacher than a jailer. He even made a small joke about how the English had deliberately made their typewriters difficult to confuse German spies, which made Marguerite smile despite herself. In the infirmary, Greta worked alongside Dr. William Bradford, a tired-looking physician in his 40s who treated her not as a prisoner, but as a fellow medical professional. He asked about her training, her experience in field hospitals, and listened to her responses with genuine interest. 3 days into their captivity, the pattern of meals had become clear. Breakfast was always substantial, porridge or eggs with toast. Lunch consisted of soup with bread and cheese. Dinner varied but always included meat, vegetables, and some form of starch, potatoes or bread, or occasionally pasta. The portions remained generous, and while the food was simple, it was consistently filling and well prepared. The German women could no longer dismiss it as a special occasion or a temporary deception. This was simply how British prisoners were fed, and the realization was fundamentally destabilizing. Marguerite spent her evenings in the small camp library, a room containing mostly administrative manuals and old British newspapers. She read everything she could find, her English improving rapidly through necessity and immersion. The newspapers, even those from early in the war, painted a picture very different from what she had been taught. Yes, Britain had experienced rationing and hardship, but the articles spoke of organized distribution systems, of fairness in resource allocation, of a functioning society, managing scarcity rather than collapsing under it. The contrast to the increasingly desperate situation in Germany was impossible to ignore. One evening, as Marguerite sat reading a newspaper from 1943, Private Cooper approached her hesitantly. He had brought a book, a collection of British recipes printed before the war. His mother had sent it to him, he explained in slow, simple English, thinking he might miss home cooking. He thought perhaps Margarita might find it interesting, might help her understand British food better. She took the book with genuine curiosity, opening it to find recipes for steak and kidney pie, for shepherd's pie, for toad in the hole, for dozens of dishes that represented everyday British cooking. That night, Marguerite shared the cookbook with the other women, translating the recipes and the introduction, which spoke of traditional British comfort foods, of meals designed to be filling and economical, of a cuisine built on making the most of available ingredients. The steak and kidney pie they had eaten that first night was not royal food at all. It was peasant food, working-class food, the kind of meal that British families had been eating for generations. The women absorbed this information in stunned silence, the final piece falling into place in their understanding of how thoroughly they had been deceived. Elsa was the first to voice what they were all thinking. If they lied about something as simple as what the British eat, she said quietly, what else did they lie about? Everything? Her question needed no answer. They could all feel the foundation of their beliefs cracking, fissures spreading through everything they thought they knew about the war, about their enemies, about their own country's strength and righteousness. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure, the sensation of certainty dissolving. Greta, ever practical, focused on the immediate implications. We are prisoners, and we eat better than our families at home, better than our soldiers in the field. If Britain can afford to feed prisoners this well while fighting a war. December arrived with frost painting the windows of the barracks each morning. The women had been prisoners for nearly a month, and the daily routine had become familiar, if not comfortable. They rose at dawn, worked their assigned duties, ate their surprisingly adequate meals, and spent their evenings in quiet conversation or reading. The initial terror had faded, replaced by a complicated mixture of guilt, confusion, and reluctant gratitude. They were safe, fed, and treated with basic dignity while their homeland suffered. The contradiction ate at them constantly. The camp's British staff had begun to differentiate the individual prisoners, learning names and personalities rather than treating them as an undifferentiated mass of enemy women. Private Cooper had taken a particular interest in the welfare of the German prisoners, checking on them during his rounds and occasionally bringing small treats, an extra portion of jam, a handful of biscuits saved from his own rations. His kindness was genuine and uncomplicated, motivated by nothing more than basic human decency toward people who happened to be on the wrong side of a war they had not personally started. Corporal Davies had made Marguerite his unofficial assistant in the administrative office, appreciating her quick mind and improving English. He taught her British military terminology, patiently correcting her pronunciation and explaining the meanings behind abbreviations and codes. Sometimes, during quiet moments between tasks, they would talk about their lives before the war. He told her about his wife and 2 daughters in Manchester, about his work as a postal clerk, about how he had been called up despite his age because men were needed everywhere. She told him carefully edited stories about Hamburg, about her family's small bakery, about her decision to join the Women's Auxiliary Corps because it seemed like an adventure compared to working behind a counter. Greta had become indispensable to Dr. Bradford in the infirmary. Her medical knowledge was current and practical, and she had a gentle manner with patients that put them at ease. The doctor had begun teaching her English medical terminology, and in return, she taught him some German, creating a working environment where language barriers gradually dissolved. He treated her as a colleague rather than a prisoner, asking her opinion on diagnoses and treatment plans, respecting her experience, even though she had served the enemy. The preparation for Christmas began in mid-December. Captain John Matthews, the officer in charge of the facility, announced that there would be a Christmas celebration for both staff and prisoners. The German women were surprised by this decision, but also moved by it. Christmas was a deeply important holiday in German culture, and the prospect of marking it somehow, even in captivity, offered a small comfort against their homesickness. The British staff seemed genuinely interested in making the celebration inclusive, asking the German women about their traditional customs and trying to incorporate elements of both British and German Christmas traditions. Anna Richter, whose youth made her particularly vulnerable to homesickness, found herself crying quietly one evening as she thought about Christmas at home with her family. Private Cooper discovered her and, instead of ignoring her distress or treating it as a security concern, sat with her. The cookbook Private Cooper had given Marguerite became an unexpected catalyst for connection between the prisoners and their captors. Marguerite began using it as a teaching tool during the evening hours, gathering interested women around a table in the common area to practice reading English through the recipes. The familiar context of cooking made the foreign language less intimidating, and soon several women were attempting to sound out ingredients and measurements, their pronunciation bringing gentle laughter from both themselves and the British guards, who occasionally stopped to listen. Elsa discovered she had a natural aptitude for the language, her ear catching the rhythms of English more quickly than most. She began asking Private Cooper to explain British dishes, not just the recipes, but the cultural significance behind them. Why was Yorkshire pudding served with roast beef? What made a proper cup of tea? What was the difference between biscuits and scones? Cooper, delighted to talk about his homeland's cuisine, became an enthusiastic teacher, his simple explanations opening windows into British life that propaganda had never revealed. The conversations about food led to broader discussions about daily life in Britain. The German women learned that British families had indeed experienced rationing and hardship, but that the systems in place had distributed scarcity fairly, rather than allowing some to starve while others hoarded. They learned about victory gardens, about how civilians had contributed to the war effort through countless small sacrifices. The picture that emerged was not of the weak, decadent enemy they had been taught to expect, but of a resilient society that had organized itself effectively to withstand years of war. Marguerite found herself translating not just words, but entire worldviews. As she moved between German and English, she became aware of how language shaped thought, how the propaganda she had absorbed had been embedded in the very vocabulary she used to describe the war. British soldiers were not invaders, but liberators in English. German efficiency became German rigidity when viewed from outside. The neutral act of translation forced her to see multiple perspectives simultaneously, and the experience was both enlightening and deeply unsettling. One evening, Corporal Davies brought a wireless radio into the common area and tuned it to the BBC. He wanted the German women to practice their listening comprehension, he explained. But Marguerite suspected he also wanted them to hear news that was not filtered through German propaganda. The broadcast that evening included a report about food distribution in liberated France, about Allied efforts to prevent starvation in areas where German forces had destroyed supplies during their retreat. The women listened in silence, hearing descriptions of German actions that contradicted everything they had been told about how their army behaved. Anna asked Marguerite to translate a phrase she had not understood. The announcer had said something about German scorched earth policies. Marguerite hesitated, then carefully explained what the term meant, how retreating forces deliberately destroyed resources to deny them to advancing enemies. "But that means leaving civilians to starve," Anna said, her voice small and confused. "We would not do that to our own people, would we?" Mid-December brought the arrival of mail, the first communication many of the women had received from Germany since their capture. The International Red Cross had been working to establish mail routes between prisoners and their families, and Captain Matthews personally delivered a stack of letters to the German barracks. The women gathered around as he read names from the envelopes, their faces reflecting desperate hope mixed with fear about what news the letters might contain. Not every woman received mail, and for those whose names were not called, the disappointment was crushing. Marguerite's letter came from her younger sister Hilda, who still lived in Hamburg with their parents. The handwriting was familiar, but the tone was not. Hilda had always been cheerful and optimistic, filling her letters with gossip and small jokes. This letter was different. It was careful, constrained, as if written by someone who knew their words might be read by censors. Between the lines of superficial news about weather and neighbors, Marguerite read a story of increasing hardship. The bakery had been closed for lack of flour. Their father's health was failing. Food rations had been reduced again. The city showed scars from repeated bombing raids. What struck Marguerite most painfully was a single sentence near the end. "We are so glad you are safe and hope you are being treated well." The implication was clear. Her family was suffering while she, the prisoner, was comparatively safe and well fed. The guilt was immediate and overwhelming. She sat on her bed, the letter trembling in her hands, tears running down her face as she struggled with the horrible unfairness of eating British steak and kidney pie while her family survived on potato soup and black bread. Elsa's letter brought even worse news. Her mother had died in October, just weeks after Elsa's capture. The letter came from a neighbor who had no way of knowing whether Elsa was even alive to receive it. The cause of death was not specified, but the neighbor mentioned that the winter had been hard, that many elderly people had not survived. Elsa read the letter 3 times, her face expressionless, before carefully folding it and placing it in her pocket. She spoke to no one for the rest of the day, moving through her duties like an automaton. Greta received no letter at all, and the absence felt like a wound. Her family had lived in Berlin, and she knew the capital had been heavily bombed. Were they dead? Displaced? Simply unable to send mail through the disrupted postal system? The not knowing was torture, made worse by the knowledge that she was safe in England while they faced unknown horrors at home. She found herself in the infirmary long after her shift ended, organizing supplies that were already organized, seeking refuge in work from thoughts she could not bear to think. That evening, the German women gathered in the common area, but the usual attempts at conversation faltered. Those who had received letters shared what news they could bear to speak aloud. Those who had received nothing sat in silent speculation about what the absence meant. The letters from home transformed the emotional atmosphere in the barracks. The women who had been gradually accepting their situation now found themselves torn between gratitude for their own relative safety and crushing guilt over the suffering of those they loved. Marguerite lay awake at night thinking about her father's failing health, about her sister's careful silence regarding what had happened to their neighborhood, their friends, their way of life. Each meal she ate felt like a betrayal, each warm night in her bed a luxury stolen from her family. Christmas dinner approached, and Captain Matthews announced it would be a proper feast: roast chicken, potatoes, vegetables, and even a small plum pudding for dessert. The British staff seemed genuinely excited about sharing this celebration with their prisoners, their goodwill obvious and sincere. But many of the German women received the news with complicated emotions. How could they celebrate when their families were starving? How could they accept generosity from the enemy while their own country suffered? Marguerite spoke with Corporal Davies about her conflicted feelings. He listened thoughtfully before responding with unexpected wisdom. "Your family would want you to eat," he said gently. "They would want you to accept kindness where it is offered. Refusing to eat will not put food on their table. It will only add your suffering to theirs. And what purpose does that serve?" His logic was sound, but logic did little to ease the emotional weight of guilt that pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Elsa had withdrawn into herself since receiving news of her mother's death. She performed her work duties mechanically, but spoke little and ate less. Private Cooper, noticing her declining condition, brought her tea and sat with her in the common area, not forcing conversation, but simply offering companionship. Eventually, she began to talk, speaking in her improving English about her mother, about their life before the war, about the guilt of having been absent when her mother needed her most. Cooper listened without judgment, his presence a silent acknowledgement of her pain. The question of how to reconcile their treatment as prisoners with their family's suffering became a constant topic of evening discussions. Some women, like Anna, argued that they should be grateful and accept their situation as fortunate compared to what might have been. Others felt that accepting British kindness was somehow disloyal to Germany, to their families, to their identity as Germans. The debates grew heated at times, voices rising in frustration as women struggled to articulate feelings that seemed too large and complicated for words. Greta, still without news from her family, found herself in a strange state of suspended emotion. She could not grieve because she did not know if grief was warranted. She could not hope because hope felt dangerous when circumstances were so uncertain. Dr. Bradford noticed her distress and offered what comfort he could, sharing his own experience of uncertainty during the early years of the war when London was being bombed and he had family there. "Sometimes," he told her, "all we can do is continue doing the work in front of us and trust that we will find the strength to face whatever comes." January 1945 arrived with bitter cold and increasingly frequent news of Allied advances into Germany. The wireless broadcasts that Corporal Davies played for English practice now included reports from liberated territories, and these reports began to mention discoveries that shocked even the British soldiers listening: concentration camps, mass graves, industrial-scale atrocities. The words were abstract at first, place names the German women had never heard, descriptions of horrors that seemed too extreme to be real. Surely this was Allied propaganda, designed to justify their invasion of Germany. But as more reports came in, accompanied by photographs in British newspapers that Captain Matthews reluctantly made available in the camp library, the evidence became harder to dismiss. Marguerite sat in the library one afternoon, forcing herself to look at grainy images of skeletal prisoners, of piles of bodies, of facilities designed for systematic murder. The newspapers gave names to these places: Auschwitz, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, places that had existed inside Germany, operating throughout the war while ordinary Germans like herself went about their lives, claiming ignorance. She felt physically ill as she read the descriptions of what had been found, of the scale of killing, of the bureaucratic efficiency with which human beings had been processed toward death. This was not the heat of battle or the accidents of war. This was deliberate, planned, sustained over years. And it had been done in the name of Germany, in the name of the ideology she had believed she was serving when she joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps. The realization that she had been part of this system, however peripherally, made her want to tear off her own skin. Elsa found her there, staring at a photograph she could not look away from, yet could not bear to see. The two women sat together in silence for a long time before Elsa finally spoke. "I did not know," she whispered in German. "I truly did not know. But does that matter? We were part of it anyway." Marguerite had no answer. Ignorance felt like a pathetic excuse when confronted with evil on this scale. How could they not have known? How could an entire nation claim not to have known? Other women gathered as word spread about what was in the newspapers. Some reacted with immediate horror and shame. Others initially refused to believe, insisting it must be exaggerated Allied propaganda. But as more evidence accumulated, as the reports continued day after day with consistent details and eyewitness accounts, even the most resistant began to accept that something truly monstrous had been happening in their homeland. The Germany they thought they knew had never existed. They had been serving a lie wrapped in a national flag. That evening, the German women gathered in their barracks and confronted what they had learned. The conversations were painful, voices breaking with emotion as women struggled to reconcile their identity as Germans with the horrors committed in Germany's name. Greta spoke about medical ethics, about how German doctors had violated every principle of healing to participate in these atrocities. Anna cried, asking how she could ever face her younger siblings if they learned she had served the regime that did these things. May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The announcement came over the wireless in the morning, Churchill's voice declaring the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany. In London and across Britain, church bells rang and celebrations erupted in the streets. At the prisoner facility outside Cheltenham, the British staff marked the occasion with relief and quiet satisfaction, but the atmosphere remained subdued out of consideration for their German prisoners, whose defeat this victory represented. The war in Europe was over, but for the women in the barracks, this brought no clarity, only deeper uncertainty. Marguerite stood at the window of the common area, looking out at the spring sunshine that seemed inappropriately cheerful. Germany had surrendered. The country she had served no longer existed in any meaningful way. Reports described total collapse, occupation zones dividing her homeland between former enemies, cities in ruins, millions displaced or dead. Victory Day for Britain was the day Germany ceased to be. She felt numb, unable to process emotions too large and contradictory to fit comfortably inside her chest. Relief that the killing would stop. Grief for everything lost. Shame for what Germany had done. Fear about what came next. The other women reacted in various ways. Some wept quietly, mourning the loss of everything familiar, even as they acknowledged that what they had served deserved to be defeated. Others sat in stunned silence, staring at nothing, their minds struggling to imagine a future that had suddenly become completely uncertain. A few expressed relief, grateful that the suffering would end, even if it meant their side had lost. The complexity of feeling both defeated and liberated, both ashamed and hopeful, created emotional tangles that defied simple expression. Captain Matthews addressed them that afternoon with characteristic decency. "The war in Europe is over," he said, speaking slowly so Marguerite could translate. "You will remain here for now until repatriation procedures can be arranged. Germany is currently occupied and conditions are difficult. We will keep you informed as we learn more about when and how you will be able to return home." The word home hung in the air, suddenly problematic. What home? To what would they return? Who would still be there? The questions multiplied faster than answers could form. Private Cooper, who had become a friend to many of the women over the months, approached their table during the evening meal. His face reflected mixed emotions. "I am glad the war is over," he said carefully. "But I know this must be hard for you. I want you to know that we do not celebrate your suffering, only the end of killing." His kindness, so characteristic of his treatment throughout their imprisonment, brought fresh tears to Anna's eyes. "You have been more generous to us than we deserved," she responded in her much improved English. "We were your enemies, and you treated us like human beings." That night, lying in her bed, Marguerite confronted the question she had been avoiding. Did she want to return to Germany? A month ago, she would have said yes without hesitation despite everything she had learned. But now, thinking about her destroyed homeland, her scattered family, the shame that would follow anyone who had served the Nazi regime even peripherally, she felt no certainty. 2 weeks after Victory Day, Captain Matthews called a General Assembly to announce repatriation procedures. The women gathered in the mess hall, their faces reflecting the anxiety of people about to learn their fates. Transportation would be arranged within the next month, Matthews explained. They would be processed through displaced persons camps, then released to return to their homes or what remained of them. Red Cross workers would assist in locating families. It was all very organized, very proper, very final. Their time as prisoners was ending. Their time as displaced Germans was beginning. After the formal announcement, Matthews opened the floor for questions. There was a long silence as the women absorbed the information, and then Marguerite slowly stood. Her hands trembled, but her voice was steady as she spoke in English. "Captain, may I ask something that might sound unusual?" Matthews nodded, his expression curious. "Some of us have been discussing our situation, and we wonder if there might be any possibility of remaining in Britain rather than returning to Germany immediately." The request hung in the air like an impossible thing, shocking even to some of the German women who had not been part of these private discussions. Matthews looked genuinely surprised, his eyebrows rising toward his hairline. "You wish to remain as prisoners?" he asked, clearly confused about why anyone would choose continued captivity over freedom. Marguerite shook her head quickly. "Not as prisoners, Captain. As displaced persons, perhaps. Or whatever status might allow us to stay and work. Several of us have lost our entire families. Others face returning to nothing. And after what we have learned about what our country did, we are not certain we can bear to go back and face the judgment we deserve from our own people." Elsa stood to support Marguerite's request, followed by Anna, then Greta, and eventually 6 more women. 10 prisoners in total, standing before their captors and asking permission to remain in the country that had defeated them. The British staff exchanged bewildered glances. This was unprecedented. Prisoners of war had clear legal status and clear repatriation procedures. What the women were requesting fell into a strange category that existing regulations had never anticipated. Matthews promised to consult with his superiors and respond as soon as possible. The announcement divided the barracks. The other 13 women chose repatriation, their reasons as valid as those who wished to stay. Some had received letters confirming that family members had survived and were waiting for them. Others felt a duty to return and help rebuild, regardless of how difficult it would be. Several could not imagine living permanently in a foreign country among former enemies. The decision to stay or go became intensely personal, and both groups understood and respected the others' choices even when they could not share them. Private Cooper approached Marguerite later that evening as she sat in the library. "Why do you want to stay?" he asked directly. She appreciated his bluntness after months of getting to know him. "Because you gave me steak and kidney pie?" she said, then smiled at his confused expression. "Because that first night, we thought you were feeding us royal food. We could not understand why prisoners would receive such meals." The steak and kidney pie had become something of a private joke among the women who had decided to stay, but beneath the humor lay a profound truth. That first meal had been the beginning of their transformation, the first crack in the wall of propaganda that had shaped their understanding of the world. Marguerite tried to explain this to Private Cooper as they sat in the library, her English now fluent enough to express complex ideas. "When you gave us that meal," she said, "you showed us that everything we had been taught was a lie. Not just about British food, but about everything." She told him about the cookbook he had lent her months ago, how it had revealed that their idea of royal British cuisine was simply ordinary British comfort food. How that small realization had opened the door to questioning everything else. If they lied about something so simple and verifiable as what people eat, how could anything else they had been told be trusted? The food had been a symbol of British abundance, yes, but more importantly, it had been a symbol of honesty. The British had not pretended to be something they were not. Corporal Davies joined the conversation, bringing his perspective as someone who had worked closely with Marguerite for months. "You have become a different person since you arrived," he observed. "That first day, you were terrified and defensive. Now you ask questions, you think critically, you challenge your own assumptions. That transformation is what makes me believe you would succeed if you stayed in Britain." His words touched Marguerite deeply, acknowledging the internal struggle that had consumed her for months. The women who had chosen to stay began preparing arguments for why they should be allowed to remain. They documented their skills and how they might contribute to British society. Marguerite could work as a translator. Greta had medical training. Elsa had administrative experience. Anna was young and adaptable and willing to learn any trade. They wrote letters to the International Red Cross explaining their situations, their lost families, their desire to build new lives in a country that had treated them with unexpected humanity. Captain Matthews received his response from military authorities faster than expected. The decision was characteristically British in its practicality. The women could not remain as prisoners since the war was over, and prisoner status required active conflict. However, given the chaos in occupied Germany and the documented loss of families, they could be reclassified as displaced persons and processed for potential resettlement. This would require British sponsors willing to provide housing and employment assistance. Without sponsors, they would be repatriated with the others. It was a bureaucratic solution that acknowledged both the unusual circumstances and the limitations of what military authorities could authorize. The challenge was finding sponsors willing to take responsibility for former enemy nationals. Britain had its own housing shortages, its own unemployment concerns, its own returning soldiers who needed jobs and homes. Asking British families to help German women when British people were still struggling seemed to many like misplaced charity. Yet the women who had chosen to stay held on to hope that the same humanity that had fed them steak and kidney pie might extend to giving them a chance at building new lives. The search for sponsors began with the people who had come to know the German women personally over the past 6 months. Private Cooper wrote to his family in northern England, explaining Anna's situation and asking if they might consider sponsoring her. His mother's response was cautious but compassionate. Corporal Davies spoke with his wife in Manchester about possibly helping Marguerite find work and housing. Dr. Bradford reached out to colleagues at hospitals, inquiring whether any might be willing to provide employment opportunities for Greta, despite her German nationality and controversial background. The Henderson family, who had been visiting the camp as part of a church outreach program, proved to be the most immediately helpful. Mrs. Henderson, the schoolteacher who had befriended several of the women, organized a meeting with her church congregation to discuss the possibility of community sponsorship. She spoke passionately about redemption and forgiveness, about the Christian duty to help those who had genuinely repented and changed. The congregation's response was mixed, with some enthusiastically supportive and others deeply skeptical about helping former Nazis, even if those women claimed to have been ignorant of the worst atrocities. The debate within the church reflected the larger debate happening across Britain. The war had just ended, the full scope of Nazi crimes was still being revealed, and many people were not ready to show mercy to anyone who had worn a German uniform. Letters appeared in local newspapers, both supporting and condemning the idea of allowing German prisoners to remain in Britain. Some argued that showing generosity to former enemies was the highest expression of British values. Others felt that priority should go to helping their own people rather than the defeated enemy. Meanwhile, the 13 women who had chosen repatriation were making their own preparations. They packed the few possessions they had accumulated, sorted through letters from home, and tried to steel themselves for whatever they would find upon return. Some expressed envy of those who had the option to stay, admitting that if they had lost their entire families, they too might prefer to remain in the relative safety and stability of Britain. Others felt that staying was a betrayal, an abandonment of duty to help rebuild Germany, even if that rebuilding would be painful and difficult. The evening before the repatriation group was scheduled to depart, both groups of women gathered for a final meal together. The atmosphere was emotional, with tears shed on both sides as they acknowledged that they might never see each other again. Helene Fischer, who was returning to Germany despite her uncertainties, spoke for the repatriation group. "We do not judge those who stay," she said. "Each of us must make the choice that fits our circumstances and our conscience. But we ask that you remember Germany when you think of us. Remember that not everyone who served was evil, that many of us were simply ordinary people caught up in something we did not fully understand until too late." Marguerite responded for those staying. "We will remember, and we will carry with us everything we learned here about kindness, overcoming hatred, about the possibility of change and redemption." June 20th, 1945. The transport vehicles arrived at dawn to carry the repatriation group to Southampton, where they would board ships bound for occupied Germany. The women who were staying gathered to say goodbye to those who were leaving. The divisions between the two groups dissolved in shared emotion and mutual respect. 13 women climbed aboard the trucks, carrying small bags containing their few possessions and letters from British soldiers and staff wishing them well. The scene was nothing like the arrival 7 months earlier, when frightened, defiant prisoners had stepped off similar trucks, expecting cruelty and finding unexpected humanity instead. Captain Matthews stood before the departing women and delivered words he had clearly chosen with care. "You came here as enemies," he said, his voice carrying across the compound, "but you leave as women who have shown courage in confronting difficult truths about your country and yourselves. I hope you will carry back to Germany the understanding that former enemies can find common ground, that redemption is possible even after terrible wrongs." Britain did not win this war by being more cruel than Germany, but by holding to values that transcend national boundaries. I hope you will help build a Germany that shares those values. Helene Fischer responded on behalf of the group, her English now confident after months of practice. "Captain Matthews," she began, "we arrived believing we knew what to expect from British captivity. We expected harshness, deprivation, perhaps abuse. Instead, you showed us kindness when you had no obligation to do so. You fed us when you could have left us hungry. You treated us with dignity when we had served a regime that showed no dignity to others. That lesson, that example of how to treat even your enemies with humanity, is what we will carry back to Germany. It is perhaps the most valuable thing we could bring to help rebuild our broken country." The women embraced, German prisoners and British soldiers alike, sharing hugs and handshakes that would have seemed impossible months earlier. Marguerite held Helene for a long moment, both women crying as they acknowledged the bond formed through shared struggle and transformation. "Write to me," Marguerite whispered in German. "Let me know that you are safe, that you found your family." Helene promised she would, though both knew that mail service in occupied Germany would be unreliable at best. The promise was more symbolic than practical, an expression of hope that their connection would somehow survive the separation. Anna gave Private Cooper a small wooden carving she had made during evening hours in the workshop, a crude but heartfelt representation of a dove. "For peace," she said simply, and Cooper accepted it with visible emotion. Greta embraced Dr. Bradford, thanking him for treating her as a colleague rather than an enemy, for helping her remember what it meant to be a healer rather than just a survivor. Elsa distributed small notes she had written to various staff members, thank you messages in her careful English, expressing gratitude for specific kindnesses remembered. As the trucks pulled away, the 10 remaining women stood watching until the vehicles disappeared from view. Then they turned back to face the camp that would be their home for an uncertain amount of time, while sponsorship arrangements were finalized. 25 years after that cold November morning, when German women prisoners first tasted steak and kidney pie and believed it was royal food, Marguerite Kessler stood before a gathering at the European Community headquarters in Brussels. She had been invited to speak about reconciliation and the unexpected paths that lead former enemies toward friendship. Now a British citizen with grown children who had never known war, she carried with her a faded cookbook, the same one Private Cooper had lent her decades earlier. Her speech that day would be remembered as a testament to how small acts of human decency can transform lives and reshape history. She spoke about that first evening in the mess hall, about the confusion and disbelief as plates of hot, substantial food were placed before women expecting deprivation and cruelty. "We thought you were feeding us like royalty," she told the audience with a slight smile. "We could not comprehend that this was simply how you fed everyone, even your prisoners." That misunderstanding was the beginning of our education about everything we had been taught to believe. The steak and kidney pie became a symbol of all the lies we had accepted without question. The story of the German women who chose to stay in Britain had become more than historical curiosity. It had influenced post-war policy toward reconciliation, demonstrated the effectiveness of treating defeated enemies with dignity rather than vengeance. Marguerite's work as a translator for refugee organizations had helped thousands of displaced persons navigate the complex process of rebuilding lives in foreign lands. Greta had become a respected nurse, eventually training others in her profession. Anna had married Private Cooper and raised a family that embodied the possibility of former enemies becoming family. Elsa had returned to Germany in 1962 as part of a cultural exchange program, finding a country transformed and committed to ensuring the horrors of the Nazi regime could never be repeated. She often said that her experience in British captivity had prepared her to appreciate how completely Germany had changed because she had experienced her own complete transformation. The women who had originally chosen repatriation in 1945 had played crucial roles in Germany's reconstruction, carrying with them stories of British humanity that helped convince other Germans that their former enemies could be trusted partners in building a better future. As Marguerite concluded her speech, she held up the faded cookbook that had taught her so much more than recipes. "In these pages," she said, "I learned that people are simply people, regardless of which side of a war they happen to be born on. I learned that kindness is not weakness, and that showing mercy to your enemies is the truest strength. Most importantly, I learned that change is possible when societies are willing to offer second chances to those who genuinely seek redemption." The story reminds us that even the smallest gestures of humanity, something as simple as a decent meal, can plant seeds that grow into lasting peace.